We continue now at the top of Daf Peivavam at Aleph Mesechet Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 86a. The Gemara is in the middle of bringing a Bryce, and the Bryce is darshaning two psukim by Korban Ola. We'll take a look at the full psukim. The pasuk says, "V'kirbo uchrav yirchatz b'moyim v'hikter hakohen es hakol hamizbecha Ola ishay reach nichoach laHashem." In this pasuk it says, "V'hikter hakohen es hakol," that the kohen burns all of it, and that would include things like the tendons and the bones, etc. But then there's another pasuk that says, "V'yasisa olosecha habasar v'hadam," and that implies that what is burned on the Mizbeach by the Korban Ola is just the basar and the dam, just the meat and the blood. And so the Brisa now continues and says, Yachol yachlo it's gidin v'atzamos v'yale basar legavi Mizbeach. If it's saying that you have to burn the basar and the dam, that sounds like you should actually remove the gidin and atzamos. You should remove the tendons and the bones and then just put the meat on the Mizbeach. Talmud Lomer, but on the other hand, the pasuk says, V'hikter hakohen es hakol, that he's going to burn all of it. And so haketzad, how so? And so if these parts, like the gidin and the atzamos, are attached to the basar, so then yalu, so then they ascend, they go up on the Mizbeach. But pershu, but let's say they separate, then afilu hein barosh ha-Mizbeach, even if they are at the top of the Mizbeach, yerdu, they come down from the Mizbeach. And the Gemara continues, Man Tana d'shamatale damar pershu yerdu, who is the Tana that holds that if they separate, then they come down from the Mizbeach? And the Gemara says, Rebbe, it's the Tana Rebbe, the Tanya. As we learned in a Brisa, the pasuk says again, V'hikter hakohen es hakol ha-Mizbecha. It says that all of it is burned on the Mizbeach, l'rabos, v'atzamos, v'hagidin, v'hakarnayim, v'hatulafayim. That comes to include the bones and the tendons and the horns and the hooves. Afilu pershu, even if they are separated according to the Tanakama of this Brisa. V'elamani mekayim v'yosiso losecha ha-basar v'adam. So what do I do with the pasuk which says that it's just the basar and the dam, it's just the meat and the blood that are burned on the Mizbeach? Lomar lach, that's to tell you the following halacha. Ichulei ola atamachzer, let's say you have that which is consumed by the ola, so then you return it to the Mizbeach, to the fire. V'i atamachzer, but you do not return to the fire. Ichulei gidin v'atzamos, let's say you have gidin and atzamos, you have tendons and bones that have been partially consumed, those do not get returned to the fire. Rebbe Omer, and Rebbe says, Kasav Echad Omer, one pasuk says, V'hikter hakohen es hakol ha-Mizbecha, all of it will be burned on the Mizbeach, riba, that is an inclusion. V'chasav Echad Omer, v'asiso losecha ha-basar v'hadam, another pasuk says meat and blood, mi'et, that's an exclusion. Haketzad, how so? Mechuborin yalu, again, if they are attached, then they ascend the Mizbeach, but pershu, if they separate from the meat, afilu hein barosh ha-Mizbeach yerdu, even if they are on the top of the Mizbeach, they come down from the Mizbeach. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, Pershu lo yalu, if they separate from the meat, then they don't ascend to the Mizbeach. And we will take a look at the Shinuya Nuschos over here. Tzarech Lomer HaPiska Pershu yerdu. It should actually say that if they separate, then they come down from the Mizbeach. V'koya Brisa Delael, it's going on the Brisa we just brought earlier, Asof Divrei Rebbe, on the end, when Rebbe says, again, Rebbe says, Pershu, Afilu hein barosh ha-Mizbeach yerdu, that if they separate, even if they're on the top of the Mizbeach, they come down from the Mizbeach. That is what we are going on over here. And the Gemara says, Amar Rebbe Rabbi Zera says, Lo shanu ala shapershu klape mata. When we say that if they separate, they come down from the Mizbeach, that is only if they separate downward. We'll see Rashi in a moment. It means away from the fire. Aval klape mala, but if it separates upward, krovehu da'akrivu le'ichol, then it's actually getting closer to being consumed by the fire, and it would not come down. Rashi explains, klape mata derech yirid, in a downward direction. It means umisrachki min hamarach, if it's distancing itself from the fire. But klape mala litzad hamarach, but klave mala, which means towards the maracha, ein zu prishas, that's not even called separation. Ela kreva etzalo icho shalesh, that's called getting closer to the consumption of the fire. But the Gemara continues and asks, Va'afilu pershu, even if they separate, the simple understanding of this question is, we're saying klape mala, that if it separates in an upward direction, so then it does not descend from the Mizbeach. Is that really true? If it separates, then we said it should not ascend on the Mizbeach. And so the Gemara says, Amar Rabba says, Hachi Kamar, this is what we mean to say. Lo shanu ela shapershu la'achar zrika. This halach is only true if they separate after the zrika, after the throwing, the application of the blood. Avol pershu kodem zrika, but let's say they separate before the zrika, before the throwing, the application of the blood, then asoy zrika v'shari sinu. Then the zrika comes and it actually permits them completely, afilu lemevad minayu kata de sakini, even to make with them the handle of a knife. And Rashi explains, Lo shanu dekamar pershu yerdu, when we say that if they separate, they descend from the Mizbeach, umiu isnu bechlal kodshim, but even though we're saying they descend, but they're still considered to be in the category of kodshim, that's elasha pershu la'achar zrika, that's if they separate after zrika, after the blood is thrown, dekevan de b'shas zrika, since at the time that the blood was thrown, mechuborim havu, they were attached to the meat, kovasan zrika l'mizbeach, so then the zrika establishes them, fixes them for the Mizbeach. And then when they separate havalu kodshim psulim, they become kodshim that are disqualified, but they're still in the category of kodshim. Aval pershu lifnei zrika, but let's say they separate before the zrika is done. To b'shas zrika lav b'nei mizbeach hayu, that at the time of the zrika they weren't meant for the mizbeach. Asoi zrika, then the zrika actually comes when the zrika is done. V'sharisinu lahedyon, and it becomes permitted even to a regular individual. It's not in the category of kodshim. Lemevad kata desakine, they can even be used to make the handles of knives, kihechi the sharya basar legabi mizbeach, just like the zrika permits the meat to go on the mizbeach, the lahachi koi, that's where it's meant to be. Kasharya nami atzamo, so too the bones are now permitted lamai dekaimi for what they're meant to. V'hainu hanoas kohanim k'Rebbi Yishmael, and that means that they can benefit the kohanim, just like Rabbi Yishmael says, as we are about to see. As the Gemara continues, Savar lo ki hadam Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Yishmael, he holds like that which Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Yishmael. Nemar lo yiyah ba'ola, it says in the pasuk lo yiyah, it says that by ola. V'nemar lo yiyah ba'asham, and it says lo yiyah by asham, by carbon asham. Ma'asham atzmos of mutarin, just like by carbon asham the bones are mutar. Af ola, so too by carbon ola, atzamos mutarin, the atzamos, the bones, are going to be mutar. And Rashi explains lo yiyah ba'ola, it says lo yiyah by ola or ha'ola. It's talking about the hide of the ola. Asher hikriv la kohen lo yiyah. It says that the hide, it goes to the kohen, it goes to hedyot, regular individuals. V'namar lo yiyah ba'asham. It also says lo yiyah by asham, kachatos ka'asham torah achas lehem ha'kohen. Lo yiyah, again it uses the word lo yiyah. Ma'asham atzmosav mutar. Now just like by an asham, the bones are mutar. Now by an asham, that's obvious. Sharei af besarom mutar. Even the meat of the asham is mutar. V'imishum nosar de bisreifa, lo shaykh nosar al b'midi de barachila. And if you're going to say that it's because of noser, it's because of what's left over. By noser is only relevant by something that is eaten. It says v'hanosur mipsar hazevach, so that applies by the meat. You can have a concept of noser that after the proper time, so it becomes disqualified, but that would not be relevant by the bones, so you don't have an issue of noser, and so the bones are mutter. And the Gemara continues and says, Mufni, it must be that these words are extra. If we're learning from Lo Yiyah, it must be extra words. Di lo Mufni, because if they're not extra, Ikal Mifrach, we can refute it. If you make a Gzeir Shava from words that are not extra, so if you have a way to refute it logically, you can refute it. And the refutation would have been as follows, Ma'lo Asham, Shekain Besaro Mutter. You can't learn from Asham, because again, as we just said, by Asham, the meat is Mutter, so you can't learn from there to the Carbanola. And the Gemara says, indeed, Lo Yiyah Yisera, the word Lo Yiyah is in fact, the words Lo Yiyah are in fact extra. Rashi says, Lo Yiyah Yisera, it's extra, the Matzi L'Michtav Or Ha'ola Asher Hikriv La Kohen. It could have just said the Or Ha'ola to the Kohen. Lo Yiyah Lamali, why does it need to say the words Lo Yiyah? Those are extra words. And the Gemara continues, Mesav Ravada Barava asks a question. The Brisa says, Atzmos Kachim, when it comes to the bones of Kachim, of Karbonos, Lifnei Zrika, so before the Zrika, Moalin Bohem, so then there is Me'ilah. If a person uses it for personal use, that's a violation and liability for Me'ilah. La'achar Zrika, but after Zrika, after the blood is thrown, Ein Moalin Bohem, so at that point in time by the bones, there is no Me'ilah. But then the Brisa says, Vishal Ola, when it comes to a Karban Ola, Moalin Bohem Liolam, there's always Me'ilah, and that goes against what we just said. We just said by Karban Ola that if they are separated, and that is before the Zrika, so then we say it's actually completely permitted. And the Gemara says, Ema, we should say, change the Brisa as follows, Vishal Ola, when it comes to Karban Ola, Pershu Lifnei Zrika, if those bones are separated before the Zrika, Ein Moalin Behen, then there is no Me'ilah, and La'achar Zrika, if it happens after the Zrika, so then already, then in that situation, Moalin Behen Liolam, so then there is Me'ilah forever in that case. And the Gemara notes, Upliga the Rebbe Lazar, this argues on Rebbe Lazar. The Amar Rebbe Lazar, because Rebbe Lazar says, Pershu Lifnei Zrika, when it comes to the bones of the Ola, if they separate before Zrika, Moalin Bohem, there is Me'ilah, Le'achar Zrika, but after Zrika, Lo Nenin, one should not get benefit, however, Velo Moalin, but there is no Me'ilah, it's just on a Darabonon level that you should not get benefit. And Rashi explains, Atzmos Kachim, the Brisa said by the bones of Kachim, this is referring to Hanecholin, this is referring to Kachim that are eaten. Kagon Chatas V'Asham, like Chatas and Asham, where the meat is eaten. So over there we say, Lifnei Zrika, before the Zrika, there is Me'ila by the bones belong, so to speak, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there is Me'ila, but after Zrika, so then there is no Me'ila. Again, Mo'alin Bohen, then before Zrika, there is Me'ila. The Ein Kan Shas Heter LaKohanim, because there you don't have a moment of Heter for the Kohanim. That's why Lefnei Zrika there is Me'ila, but La'achar Zrika, where at that point in time it becomes mutter to the Kohanim. So then we say also when it comes to the bones, there is no Me'ila. But then again, the Brisa went on to say that when it comes to Ola, there is always Me'ila. And so the Gemara revised the Brisa. The Gemara said that what the Brisa means is, by Ola, if the bones separate, then Lefnei Zrika, there is no Me'ila. La'achar Zrika, there is Me'ila. And then the Gemara said, Uplikad Rebbe Lazar at the Rabbah, and Rebbe Lazar argues on what Rabbah says, because Rebbe Lazar says that Pershu Lifnei Zrika Mo'alin Bahen Liolam. According to Rebbe Lazar, if they separate before Zrika, there is going to be Me'ila. The Kevon de Pershu, the way Rebbe Lazar understands, is once they separate from the meat, Inhu Lav B'nei Haktar and Inu. So now you're not going to burn them anymore; they're not part of the meat. And Lo Ahani Luhu Zrika, and therefore the Zrika is actually not going to be effective anymore as far as the bones are concerned. Uvi Isurayu Kaimin. So therefore they had a prohibition, and that prohibition remains. The Zrika doesn't affect anything. That's how Rebbe Lazar understands when it separates before Zrika. And Pershu La'achar Zrika, now if they separate, let's say, after the Zrika, so Lo Nenin Midrabanan. So on a Drabanan level, you shouldn't get benefit. However, on a Doraisa level, they are permitted. Velo Moalin, there is no Me'ila. Rabbi Yishmael, that follows what Rabbi Yishmael said. The Gamar Mi Loyia, because again, he learns from Loyia, the Asham, which is by Asham, V'Asham, and by the case of Asham, Pershu La'achar Zrika, who that is the case over there, it's separated after the Zrika, the Vahade Basar Ishtaru, while they were together with the meat, it became permitted, Bizrika LaKohanim. Again, through that Zrika, it became permitted, because that's the whole idea by Asham. The Zrika permits the meat, and then it permits the bones as well. That's what is happening. So then it's set, and then it separates after the Zrika. And so again, we're going to say on a Durabanan level, Lo Nanin, that's just a Durabanan level, but there's no Me'ila on a Doraisa level. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, V'chulon shepako me'al gabi ha-mizbeach. In all of these cases, if they get dislodged from the Mizbeach, lo yachzir, then they are not returned to the Mizbeach. And Rashi explains, V'chulon, all of these cases, the Shenu Nescho says the Girsa should be Bein Psulin Sha'alu, whether we're talking about that which was disqualified, which ascended the Mizbeach, Tetnan Behen Lo Yerdu, by items where it says that once they ascend, they don't come down. We could be talking about that here in the Mishnah. And Bein Atzamos V'gidim, and we also could be talking about Atzamos and Gidim, bones and tendons, Shehel and Mechuber, which were brought up because they were attached to the meat at that time, V'achalt on Ha'esh, and they were consumed by the fire. In all of these situations, Shepaku, Me'al HaMizbeach La'oretz, if they get dislodged from the Mizbeach and fall to the earth, then Lo Yachzir, they don't get returned, meaning Ein Sarech La'achzir. Rashi says it's not necessary to return them to the Mizbeach. And the Mishnah continues, V'chein kachelis, the same would be true by ember, an ember, shepaka me'al gabe ha-mizbeach, if it gets dislodged from the Mizbeach, lo yachzir, it is not returned to the Mizbeach. A varim shepaka me'al gabe ha-mizbeach, let's say you have limbs that are dislodged from the Mizbeach, so then it depends. Kodem chatzos, if it happens before midnight, yachzir, so then it's returned to the Mizbeach, umoalin bahem, and at that point in time, there still is me'ila if there's a misuse. But la'achar chatzos, if it gets dislodged after midnight, lo yachzir, then it's not returned to the Mizbeach, ve'ein mo'alin bahem, and there is no me'ila. And Rashi explains, Kodem chatzos yachzir, before chatzos it is returned. B'gemara mefarish taima, the Gemara will explain the reason. Ulin bohen, and there is me'ila. Again, that's kodem chatzos, when it's supposed to be returned, there is me'ila. Ta'akati b'nei mizbeach nenu, because they still belong to the Mizbeach. But again, ve'ein mo'alin bohen, but in a situation after chatzos, there is no me'ila. Dekevan dehavalu kimu'uchalin, since it's like they were consumed already by the Mizbeach. Kidem mefarish b'gemara, as the Gemara will explain, havalu davar shenasis mitzvah, so that's something where the mitzvah has been completed, ve'ein mo'alin bo, and there is no me'ila. And the Gemara says, Hechi Dami, what exactly is the case? We talk about limbs that they're dislodged from the Mizbeach, and so Kodem Chatzos, they're returned. After Chatzos, they're not returned. What's the situation? Ide Isbuhu Mamish, if they still have substance, they weren't consumed to the extent that they lost their substance, so Afilu La'achar Chatzos Nami, even after Chatzos, they should be returned to the Mizbeach. And Ide Lesbu Mamish, if there's no substance, Rashi says, Ide Lesbu Mamish and Nisrfu Kulin, if they were entirely burned, so Afilu Kodem Chatzos Nami, Chilo, so then before Chatzos also, they should not be returned to the Mizbeach. And the Gemara says, Lo no tzricha, it is necessary, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Pei Vav Amid Beis.